Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of Rabbi Adam Kligfeld's Yoma class.
Well, what I want you to think about as we're reading this is, in the same way you would read a series of verses from the Torah, what questions would you ask on this Mishnah, right? The Mishnah is intended to be straightforward. It's supposed to be an easy to memorize, easy to transmit collection of rabbinic law and lore, mostly law, but some lore. But obviously the Mishnah deserved and needed more interpretation, because that's why you have the Gemara, that's why you have the Talmud. And that's why you have the commentaries, right? You have the rabbinic commentary directly on the Mishnah from the Gemara. And then, of course, you have later medieval commentary and modern commentary directly on the Mishnah, both taking into account material from the Gemara and not. So let's see if we can raise some questions on this Mishnah. Mishnah, chapter 1, Mishnah 3. And remember that what happened in Mishnah 1 was that the Kohen Gadol would be brought to this Lishkat Palhedrin or Parhedrin, depending on which version of the word you're going by, to be isolated for about 7 days before Yom Kippur. Okay, I skipped over the Mishnah number 2. Masrulo zikenin ziknei veitin. They sent to him, or delivered to him, elders from the elders of the court, v'korin lefanav, and the implied they here are the elders, would read or recite in front of him Baseder Hayom, from the order of the day. Okay, I'm not going to comment on it yet. I just want to get the basic words out. I want to hear your questions. But Omrimlo, they would say to him, to who? The Kohen Gadol. Ishi, interesting phrase. My man, my master, sir. Is that a Mishnaic way of saying sir? It's a very interesting formulation. Even in when referring to one's husband in rabbinic law, you wouldn't say Ishi, it's Ba'ali. So the question is, what does Ish mean here? My man, sir, something. Ishi Kohen Gadol, sir Kohen Gadol. Kra ata baficha. Now you read it from your mouth. Right? So the presumption is that the elders have been reading from Seder Hayom, the order of the day. I'll leave that unexplained. And at some point they say to him, sir, your turn. Shema shachachta. Maybe you forgot. O shema lo lamata. Or maybe you never learned. Period, right? So that's the first sentence of the Mishnah. A lot happens in that first sentence, and we'll go back to it. Erev Yom HaKippurim, on the day before Yom Kippur, so we have to imagine that the thing that was described in the first sentence is happening every day of those 7 days leading up to Yom Kippur when he's in isolation. Shachari, so morning, the morning of Erev Yom Kippur, Ma'amidin oto b'shar mizrach. They place him at the eastern gate of perhaps the chamber he's in, closer to the Holy of Holies. Uma'avirin lefanav. They would make pass in front of him. Not sure, this is clearly not evocative of the Unatana Tokef, because the Unatana Tokef is about 1,000 years after that. But for those of us who associate Unatana Tokef with Shana Yom Kippur, the idea of being ma'avirin lefanav, having the animal go before someone else, right? And the Unatana Tokef, the image is the shepherd and the sheep. This is animals, but it's coming in front of the high priest for a different reason. Parim, bulls or oxen. Ve'elim, rams. Ukvasim, and sheep. Kedei shiehei makir, so that here, it's a singular noun, so assumedly it's the Kohen Gadol, would makir, recognize, viragil, and become familiar ba'avodah, with the worship service. That's the Mishnah. 2 sentences. Information is that the Zakenim are reading the order of the day in front of him. At some point they say, you need to do it yourself, lest you forgot, lest you never learned it. And on the day of, they would parade in front of him all of the animals that he would have to be sacrificing on Yom Kippur the next day, so that he would recognize them, be familiar with them, and know what to do. Okay. Don't try to answer the questions. Just who can raise a question or two on this Mishnah? You can unmute. You can actually, a good idea. Raise your hand and I'll call on you, and then you can mute and unmute. Yes, Marshall.
Why do they have to instruct the high priest to do this?
Right. This is like Ikar Chaser min HaSefer, like the main thing is missing from the text. This is, the person who's been primed his entire life for this moment. Right? So one question is, what do the Zikanim know that the high priest don't know? You could ask a meta question. Why is it significant? Like putting aside whether or not this is actually how it happened, right? Because this is now written after the fact. Why is it significant in a rabbinic text, a Mishnaic text, that they have the image of the high priest in some ways lowered down and needing to be raised up by the scholars? Okay, good. Larry, yes, and then David.
Why do they implicitly insult him by suggesting that he either has forgotten or would not have learned?
Great.
It's a strange thing.
There's a covetic way and a non-covetic way to tell someone in authority that they need to shore up. I think it's a Masechet Kiddushin that it says that if you have to correct a rabbi or a parent, you do it in the form of a question. You say, is it not true that perhaps the rule is this way, as opposed to saying you're reading it wrong, right? So this is the opposite of that. You read it yourself, lest you forgot it or you never learned it, right? So it's a question on the question. Why do they have to teach him? And why is the communication to him so direct and potentially insulting? There you go.
Yeah, sorry. Thankfully, Zoom popped up and said I was muted. So, just regarding the all of the oxen and rams being passed before him to recognize them, could this also be a verification process that they are unblemished? So, is it on him if something slips by?
Good. So I'm gonna turn your question around and to make it a more direct question on the Mishnah, but I'm glad you raised that. You could imagine that if we were ma'avirining, if we were passing in front of the high priest, these animals, the reason why we would be doing so is so that he could assess their kashrut. He could be the mashkiach. So why is it that if we're going to do this ritual where the day before these poor animals are going to be slaughtered, they are coming before him, it's not so that he can exemplify his expertise, but rather so that we make sure that he has the expertise, right? So your question actually represents the way that it would have made more sense. Let's make sure that he's comfortable and feels that the kashrut and the standards of each of these animals is as it should be. But that's not what we say the reason is. Barry and then Norm?
So a statement and then a question. Well, I'll start with the question first. Who are the elders?
Great.
And who are the elders of the elders? And my sense is the high priest is in a state of being born again. He's been born as a high priest for the ceremony. He's been wrapped and covered and taken care of by the elders of the elders.
Aha. Good. So it's not just, so who are the Zikanim? And Barry's reading very closely that it's Masrulo Zikanim mi Ziknei Bedin. So there are elders of the Beit Din. From those, some group of uber elders were chosen. Who are they and why were they chosen? And you're also asking us to imagine kind of the optics and the aesthetics and the symbology of what's happening with the high priest cloistered in a narrow space and then emerging, you're suggesting, as a new priest almost from scratch, as if he's learning this all over again, right? And by the way, we don't have anything in the Mishnah that suggests that if it's the same that this is only on the high priest's first year on the job, right? This might have been the high priest's 23rd year on the job. It suggests that this ritual happened every single year. Are there any other hands up? I can't see. I have to scroll. Ilana, please.
I guess just to raise the possibility that that rather than sort of insulting the high priest by saying, hey, read it yourself with your own mouth, maybe it just reflects the idea that perhaps the high priest has read it only has heard it through other people's mouths. In other words, has not examined it himself, has just taken for granted the words and perhaps the interpretations of others, hasn't experienced it himself.
Yeah.
something like that.
Good. So we're shifting a bit from questions to answers, which is fine. And if I could just reframe that, perhaps what's going on here is a little bit less, not sinister, but insulting, which is we're learning something very important about, how people learn, right? It's one thing to have, for him to have heard it from his mentor. It's another thing to actually say it out loud yourself. By the way, I do this all the time with students. When I have B'nai Mitzvah students write out an outline for their drash, even though it's basically the same format and outline every single time, I don't just hand it to them and read it to them. I have them write it out so that in the process of it coming from their typing hands or their fingers, their mind is actually working on it on a different level than if they were just experiencing it auditorily, right? So that might be a softening of, right? Larry said, "Kra'ata b'ficha" seems quite insulting. You do it yourself, maybe you forgot it. And Alana is suggesting maybe that's actually the proper way to instruct someone. Now it's your turn, right? Stevie's hand was up, and then we'll go into some of the commentary.
Are you ready for answers or still just questions?
Let me see if there are any more questions on the Mishnah, meaning questions one would ask on the Mishnah. Marshall?
The first word is sort of interesting, masru. They delivered, we know the word masoret is a tradition. What's being implied by the use of that word?
Good, right? Another question which, as far as I can tell, the commentaries don't spend a whole lot of time on. Sometimes a verb is just a verb, but it's an evocative verb because of the notion of Mesorah and, the transmission of tradition. This might just be the Mishnaic Hebrew word to say bring to him, but I'm glad you raised that. Okay, any other questions besides Stevie's wanting to give us some answers? Okay, Stevie, let's go to you, and then we're going to look at some commentaries.
Okay, so two thoughts, I guess. First on the why do they have to, teach him? And it surprisingly almost seems like a democratization of the status of the high priest, that you have to be born into it, but anyone can do it, right? Because people are helping you through it, which is somewhat surprising but interesting. And on the second part, on the animals, I think this translation is a little bit problematic with the last phrase here. It says, become familiar with the service, as though that line applies to the whole Mishnah. And it could also be read that the avodah meaning, right, for the service, right, that the animals will be familiar with him, right, like the president, meeting the turkeys the day before Thanksgiving, so that when they do the big ceremony in front of the cameras, the turkeys don't go berserk, right? So the animals. So I guess the superficial, or I guess the first part of that would be that the animals will, be comfortable with this person being around them who's not their normal, feeder or person who takes care of them. And then I think on a deeper level is the idea that when the priest is going to, slaughter an animal, that it's not like he just bought the animal that day, but it's actually an animal that he's got some sort of relationship with, which, sacrifices, I think, are intended to be that way, that we know that there were people selling animals, right outside the temple, but I think the idea of the idealized sacrifice would be a sacrifice of an animal that's an animal that as opposed to an animal that you just got for that purpose.
Good. Let me start with the second comment first, right? Prepositions in Hebrew are sometimes mysterious and pluripotent, right? So ragil ba'avodah, so that he, the high priest, would become aware of, makir, ragil ba, and familiar with. You're saying it might not necessarily mean that to remind him how to do the ritual, but so that he become familiar with these particular animals for the ritual that's going to happen tomorrow. That's true. It's true that the b there on avodah does not tell us which way to read that. And the first comment, we're really now getting into the good material, and it's going to lead right into the Bartanura, right? The Mishnah is, in many ways, a collection of the most important rabbinic laws and stories that the rabbis want to transmit to the next generations, their understanding of the Torah truly lived out. And in some ways, it's a polemical text. It's a polemical text that is written both during and to celebrate the triumph of a scholarly class, and we discussed this a little bit last time, over an inherited class, where leadership comes from what you know and your mastery, not whom you were born to. So you can imagine the polemics in this scene, right? You've got a high priest who may or may not, well, hold on a second, know everything, who may or may not have earned his position. Maybe he was just the oldest son of the previous high priest, and there are plenty of British kings whose oldest children are not necessarily the right fit for the throne. And you've got the Zaken, who spent his entire adult life, and probably a lot of his childhood, independent of how he was born, learning the very material that this high priest is going to get the credit to actually perform. So this might be a text which shows us a window into the Pharisee-Sadducee split, right? The Sanhedrin victorious over, I don't know, the perhaps the well-heeled and well-bred and well-born high priests. Larry, and then I want to read the Bartanura.
Say briefly, I think we're making too much of this. If you extract the insulting line, which I think is explained by the fact that by the time that they wrote this, they were well aware that the high priest was often a not such a credible person. I think there were a lot of people who rose to it by bribery and other things. The rest of it simply saying, let's rehearse.
Yeah.
And ragil is like targil. It's a practice.
Yeah.
It's a practice to do. So don't mess up because it's a big deal. Like I'm sure you and Rabbi Cantor Chorny do before the high holidays as well, to make sure that it's all staged and choreographed correctly.
Great. And remember what Larry just said when we get to not the Bartanura, but the commentary a few after that, which may not happen until next week. The piece that suggests to me that this is at least a little bit polemic, it's one thing to say Shema Shachachta. Maybe you forgot. I forget things all the time. And that's why Chazara, relearning your material is significant. And in fact, it's a rabbinic value. So they wouldn't be poo-pooing the notion that he had to do Chazara because they've instituted the notion. But Shema Lo Lamata, perhaps you've never learned this, right? There's a shtickle of maybe high priest, I don't know, maybe you were never taught this in whatever, priestly palace you were brought up in. The Bartanura, Rabbi Obadja Bartanura, an Italian commentary on the Mishnah, kind of the classic Middle Ages or late Middle Ages commentary on the Mishnah. On the phrase Shema Lo Lamata, perhaps you didn't ever study it. The Mikdash Sheni, during the Second Temple period, right, from the time that Ezra built it in the 5th or 4th century BCE until it was destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE, Hayut Tzrichin Lachach, they needed to throw in this line to the high priest, suggesting that according to Bartanura, this ritual, this litany, was not said to high priests in the 10th, 9th, 8th, 7th, 6th centuries BCE, because there wasn't a problem. Shahayu ma'amidin kohanim gdolim, because in the Second Temple period, they would prop up high priests, she'ena mehuganim, that are not, it's a great word, mehuganim. Kahogen means appropriate. Sometimes this one's translated as honest. By the way, the translations here are where Safari has its own translations. I took them. A couple down below, I made my own translations. So the translation of the Mishnah and the translation of Bartanura is just whatever translations on Safari. You may know the word hagun from the Hineni prayer that the Chazan says before Musaf. Afa pi she'eni chadai v'hagun l'chach. Even though I might not be worthy or hagun, ready, prepared, knowing what to do for this thing. So in the Second Temple period, according to Bartanura, many high priests who had the most significant ritual position in the community were not appropriate, did not know what to do. Al pi hamachut. Rather, they got there via their relationship with the king. The ilu b'mikdash rishon. But during the First Temple period, lo hayu ma'midin kohen gadol, they would only appoint or elect a Kohen Gadol, Ela Hagadol Shebakohanim, properly would be the most worthy and the grandest of the high priests, B'chokhmah, in wisdom, B'noi, in aesthetics and beauty, B'choach, had to be a strong guy, Uba Osher, and wealth. So even in the less corrupt First Temple period, part of your qualifications to be a high priest had to do with money, and that's going to come up later in the commentary. V'im lo hayalo Osher, And let's say the high priest didn't have wealth of his own. He's now, I think, still rhapsodizing about the first temple period, which is considered to be, romantically a more simple time, even though the books of Kings suggest that it was never really a simple time. Echav Kohanim, his brother Kohanim, Megadlinoto, would raise him up, Mishalehem, from their own. That means they would donate, right? If it was significant that the high priest be able to kind of bring into the high priesthood some of his own funds, if he was proper in chokhmah and wisdom and noi and koach, but didn't have enough money, his other high priests would help him pay the initiation, or help him pay the fee. Shenemar, as it says in Vayikra Kaf Aleph, 21st chapter of Vayikra, v'hakohen hagadol me'echav. It's a wonderful read of that phrase. Pshat hagadol, hakohen hagadol me'echav is the kohen gadol who is greater than his brothers. But remember, prepositions in Hebrew can mean several things. Me can mean than, comparatively. Me can mean from. The kohen who became gadol from his brothers, gadluhu mishalachav, that they raised him up with what they had in their own. So the Bartanura suggests that what we're dealing with here in this Mishnah is kind of the realpolitik of a high priest who didn't even have the wisdom of the first temple high priest, but maybe had to collect some extra money, but may have no qualifications to be in this role, except that he was somehow in with the king of the generation, or he'd been appointed for some reason, or maybe by implication only had osher, only had wealth, and had nothing else. When we meet next time, and I'm sorry to cut off here, but I'm kind of committed to ending this at 8:30 for my sake and for your sakes, we'll talk a little bit more about what is the positive implication of their reviewing the material with him. And one of the commentators we're going to read looks at the list of animals that they would bring before him. Right, and I'll leave this as a cliffhanger: a par, an ayil, and a keves, a bull, a ram, and a sheep. There is one very interesting animal name, particularly as you think about the rituals of Yom Kippur, that is not on this list. And the question is the absence of that animal name interesting or uninteresting? And we'll get to that when we meet next week.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.